Good morning. I'm Wright, Chief Warrant Officer, United States Army, retired. This morning I'm going to share with you some information about a subject which is dear to my heart, United States involvement in Vietnam during the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and early 70s. I myself spent about 2.5 years in Vietnam, living in Vietnam, both with the United States Army and as a civilian pilot with a company by the name of Air America Incorporated. During that course of time, I flew combat operations as an Army helicopter pilot and as a civilian helicopter pilot, overseeing the ceasefire which came about as the Paris Peace Accords of early 1973. Before we get into U.S. involvement during the several decades that the United States government and U.S. forces were directly involved, we must take a look back at the colonial involvement of the French and the Vietnamese in the former French Indochina. A little bit of that history. The French colonial occupation history dates back to roughly 1859 through the period of 1883, at which time French naval and land forces invaded and solidified the colonization of this area here, all of what is known as Vietnam, north and south, the countries or areas of Cambodia and of Laos. France laid siege to these, used Vietnamese nationals and Cambodians and also Laotians to solidify their colonies under French rule. And this rule lasted between 1859 through the 1954, at which time the French, in accordance with the Geneva Accords, relinquished colonial rule and turned it over to the Vietnamese. Well, let's chat about that a little bit here so we have a better understanding of it. First of all, why did the French wish to colonize what became known as French Indochina? A number of reasons, primarily economic. During that time, the British Empire held Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and used those as ports of commerce and extracted great financial benefit from these territories. The Dutch, going back to the late 16th, 17th century, had occupied what is called Dutch Indonesia, which we can't see on this map, but it's an area which comprises Java, Sumatra, the Celebes Islands, northern New Guinea, Borneo, and is very rich in minerals such as nickel, uranium, oil, and also rubber plantations. Some of the French businesses of note which developed in French Indochina are the Michelin Rubber Company, Michelin Tires. They're still there, believe it or not, through surrogates. But also, Vietnam is one of the greatest rice-producing countries in the world. It is very rich in the southern part, down in the Delta region, and also up in the Red River Valley, up in the northern part of Vietnam. In 1940, France comes under Vichy governmental control with the collapse of French resistance to the Germans in Europe. Consequently, her colonies, the French colonies, come under Vichy, which has a non-aggression pact with the Japanese and with the Axis forces of Germany and Italy. The Japanese at that time were had been at war invading China in 1931, and they had their eye on the Dutch East Indies and also French Indochina because of its geographical location, but primarily because of its raw materials, which the Japanese needed to support their war industries. Subsequently, the Japanese began to occupy former French Indochina, and also after December 7th, 1941, they occupied Dutch Indonesia and also the Philippine Islands. And it took them several months to consolidate those acquisitions after bitter fighting between United States forces, British forces, and Dutch forces. At the end of World War II, France reinforced the former French Indochina with the French Foreign Legion and other French forces. Agreements had been made with the Roosevelt administration during World War II and with the British and other allies that France could go back and take possession of her former colonies, which she did. This began a civil war with Vietnamese nationalists, one of the most prolific, who went under the nom de guerre of Ho Chi Minh, or otherwise known as Bác Ho, Uncle Ho. Vo Nguyen Giap, General Giap, a famous military general of the Viet Minh, who orchestrated the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. We'll get into that here a little later. The French being involved in direct combat operations against the Viet Minh, or the Vietnamese nationalists, who were communists and made no bones about it, especially Ho Chi Minh. They were being supported by the communist Chinese and the Russians indirectly with arms and supplies. The United States, we had engaged in support of the French because after Roosevelt died in 1945, President Truman came into office and supported the French in their fight against the communists of the Viet Minh. Changing governments in the United States, 1953, Dwight Eisenhower came into power in the Republican Party. The United States had been involved in the Korean War at the same time, beginning in June, July of 1950. The French were having a tough time fighting the Viet Minh in Indochina. The deciding factor of the French defeat was at Dien Bien Phu, up in the northern part of the country. After a protracted engagement, the French acknowledged their defeat. A treaty was brokered by the United States and other countries, Russia being involved as well, in Geneva, Switzerland. This became known as the Geneva Accords of 1954. And what it did, in essence, was to set the foundation for French withdrawal from their colonies in Indochina, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, and to allow the Viet Minh to take legal control of the northern part of the country. Further agreements and negotiations set the stage for Emperor Bao Dai, the last of the Vietnamese monarchs, to act as an interim leader of a provisional Vietnamese government in the southern part of the country. The country was divided, in theory, at the 17th parallel. Tens of thousands of Vietnamese, especially those of the Catholic faith and Buddhists, migrated from the northern part of the country into the south because they feared the communists would follow up with religious persecution, being atheist as they are. This caused quite a influx of refugees, by the tens of thousands from the north to the south, and a few thousand Vietnamese from the southern part of the country relocated to the north. Cambodia and Laos became independent countries and not aligned. About this same time, the United States, under the Eisenhower administration, signed an agreement called the SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. The geopolitics were moving along quite rapidly between the Western and Eastern political camps. The West, by the European nations of Great Britain, or NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, with its main member, the United States. Here we have the SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which is primarily funded by the United States, with assistance from Thailand, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and South Vietnam was also a signatory to it, as was New Zealand, Australia, and other countries of Southeast Asia. The United States took over military assistance and advisory groups in 1955 to the newly formed South Vietnamese government. And we supplied them with arms and ammunition and training. This continued for a number of years up until the late 50s. Emperor Bao Dai, who was known as a European playboy, Bao Dai abdicated, moved to France, and he was replaced by the Diem government. Those of you who are old enough will remember that in the early 1960s, President Diem and his brother, Nhu, who had a very racy wife called Madame Nhu, also known as the Dragon Lady, cover of Life magazine, 1962-63. I was in high school at that time, but I read Life magazine every week, and they were in the news. The Kennedy administration, John JFK, he was supporting a number of anti-communist movements at the time. The Bay of Pigs invasion, unfortunately, which didn't work out in Cuba, and also American Special Forces, which had been reorganized, the Green Berets, and we sent small advisory groups with Kennedy's blessing to Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam to assist them in improving their military posture, as the Viet Minh up in the North Vietnamese, had been actively infiltrating with arms and supplies to the Viet Cong, who was their surrogates in South Vietnam. And they were operating actively with terrorist, what we would call terrorist attacks against railroads, transportation lines, and intimidating through kidnapping and torture of those Vietnamese civilians, teachers, local political administrators such as mayors and city councilmen, if they did not go along with their communist manifesto. And this is rather well documented history. So a real state of political flux is going on, in essence, a civil war between the North and the South is a state of fact at that time in the late 1950s, escalating into the 1960s. November 1963, John F. Kennedy is assassinated. Lyndon Baines Johnson becomes the President of the United States. Early 1964, a major political action is taken by the President of the United States with the approval of Congress, called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. What did the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution do? Well, in essence, it escalated United States direct combat involvement in Southeast Asia, and specifically authorizing punitive bombing action by U.S. naval aircraft, primarily off aircraft carriers, in retaliation for alleged attacks by North Vietnamese patrol boats against United States ships in international waters. And at the same time, we increased our support for the South Vietnamese armed forces. A bit of note right quickly, President Diem and his brother Nhu were assassinated in a coup d'etat within 2 weeks of President Kennedy's assassination, oddly enough. And Vietnamese military leaders allied with the United States came into power. A number of them, one in particular, Air Vice Marshal Wen Cao Ki, who I've met personally in 1973. General Key, or Air Vice Marshal Key, was quite a well-known fighter pilot, had personally flown attack missions in A-1E Sky Raiders against the North. And Key became premier for several years, but subsequent other leadership came in and out of power with the Vietnamese government in the South. Ho Chi Minh, General Giap, and many others continued to control the North. United States military involvement escalated, though, after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, because Congress allowed the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, to, without a declaration of war, to engage in essence, a war with congressional support. And this is important to read to understand how this occurred and why it was legal for the United States of America and our armed forces to do what we did over the course of the next 10 years. I won't go into great detail about the U.S. Armed Forces buildup, just to say this. By 1969, and I arrived personally in Vietnam after graduating from U.S. Army pilot training as a warrant officer on the 4th of February, 1969. And at that time, U.S. forces had built up to almost 500,000 men and women in uniform in South Vietnam, a sizable amount to say the least. By the time I left there in the Army, 19 months later, Vietnamization process and de-escalation, we had the invasion of Cambodia. President Nixon was in power at this time, which was a very successful combat operation. And later, I had rotated back to the States. Lam Son 719, the incursion using South Vietnamese forces into Laos. Fortunately, I missed that. We took quite a few casualties, and I had quite a few friends personally that were wounded or lost in that operation. But its mission was to cut supply lines that the North Vietnamese, through the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a huge network of roads and trails which were used to supply weapons, ammunition, food, etc., from the north to the south, and also into sanctuaries in Laos and to Cambodia. But by 1972, the United States had reduced its forces down to under 100,000, but we still had the 7th Fleet in the Gulf of Tonkin and a very sizable presence. The United States, through the Nixon administration, had, and Dr. Henry Kissinger, our Secretary of State at the time, Dr. Kissinger had set the foundations in Paris, so the so-called Paris Peace Conferences. The North Vietnamese, which was well recorded, it took them, I think, close to 2 years just to come to a resolution as to the design of the table that they would meet at. This sounds bizarre. They finally agreed upon a round table. In the meantime, tens of thousands of people are being lost in combat operations in the former French Indochina. The bombing of Hanoi in December of 1972 brought the North Vietnamese to the peace table because they knew that President Nixon wasn't fooling around anymore. He said, hey, if you don't make peace, we're going to show you how to make war, and we did. I've talked to quite a few B-52 crews that were in Operation Linebacker and other direct combat operations at that time frame, and this is what brought the Paris peace negotiations in January of 1973 to a conclusion. The president of South Vietnam complained bitterly that we gave them too much, and when the Paris Peace Accords were signed in early 1973, North Vietnamese forces were allowed to remain into positions that they had militarily taken in the south, especially many of the special forces camps along the Cambodian border. In fact, all the way down, well, some up on the Laotian border, but all the way down the periphery here, they remained in place. How this oversight was accomplished is just amazing. It should never have happened, but it set the foundation for an interim ceasefire, the withdrawal of all American forces except for 200 U.S. forces, which comprised the Defense Attache's office. So 200 Americans were left as logistic support for the South Vietnamese government, and approximately 5,000 American contractors were allowed to remain, which supported the logistical activities of supplying the Vietnamese. We also had the United States Agency for International Development, agricultural experts, and others who were very evident. So we still had a relatively small presence. When you think just several years before 1969, we had 500,000 United States forces in South Vietnam, and now we've gone down to 200 military members as part of our status of forces agreement outlined in the Paris Peace Accords. But an important thing to see, a provision to oversee this ceasefire, was the formation of the ICCS, International Commission for Control and Supervision. What did they do? Well, they were a four-nation party composed of the Hungarians and the Polish and the Canadians and the Indonesians. Air America was given the contract to provide aircraft support to fly this four-nation inspection teams throughout South Vietnam and articulate and record violations. I can say personally, as I was flying one of those aircraft at the time, it was a ceasefire in name only. We lost a number of aircraft shot down, and not very peacefully, I'll say directly, and it was a very tenuous time. It was evident to all of us there that were engaged in this activity that this ceasefire was nothing more than an interlude to a military buildup by the North Vietnamese and invasion of the South. And this came to fruition just 2 years later on April the 29th, 1975, Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese. And since Nixon was out of power, Gerald Ford had taken over as the interim president until the elections, which brought Jimmy Carter into power. Anyway, Congress did not wish to provide any further military relief to or support to the South Vietnamese, and the rest is history. And but anyway, on that note, I had personally moved down to Indonesia. I went to work for Indonesia Air Transport. I was in Bangkok when Saigon fell. I can tell you that it was as if a huge dark cloud had come over Southeast Asia. Tens of thousands of Vietnamese and others were trying to leave the country. And many of them were married to American nationals who were working, in fact, where I was down in Indonesia, for petroleum companies and other companies. And their loved ones were lost, sometimes for months, and then a note from the Red Cross would come that they were in Hong Kong. They had been picked up by a ship out in the South China Sea and saved from drowning and what have you in many cases, but many were lost also. But that's another story in itself. The important fact here is that April 29th, 1975, the communists were successful after a protracted conflict, and the country is now unified under communist control. In 2009, I went back to Southeast Asia for almost 2 months, and along with 4 other former Army helicopter pilots and several others, and we went to Hanoi, which I never thought I would visit, and also toured down through the southern part of the country in Saigon and other areas which I had served with in the military and as a civilian. Tremendous change, much of it to the good. However, there's no doubt that the communists maintain control. The People's Army, they stay in the background, but there's no doubt that they run the country. However, the new generations that are coming up in Vietnam, they've found the internet. So you can't keep them isolated forever, and I think, it's my guess and personal opinion, that within the next 20 years, you will probably see the iconic pictures of Bac Ho or Ho Chi Minh, which are on all the roads between Hanoi and Saigon, will disappear, and you'll see a more democratic form of government come to pass in Vietnam. But it will take time. Right now, as I speak, the Vietnamese government has reached out to the United States in the last number of years, and we are having joint U.S. Navy and Vietnamese Navy training operations. So what the bottom line of it is there is that the Vietnamese fear the Red Chinese, the Chinese Communist Party. They are historical enemies. The Russians have left because in 1991 they had an economic collapse, so their advisors were repatriated to Russia. So the Vietnamese have a lot more agreements and arrangements with the Western world than they did prior to that collapse of the Soviet Union. A new world, without a doubt, and hopefully one that will become more beneficial to the Western countries, the United States, who were belligerents at one time, and the Vietnamese people. Thank you for your attention.